Hello and welcome to another edition of Pchem Lab Screencast. I'm Jeff Yager. Today I'm going to introduce what we do at Arizona State University in Chemistry 343, which is Physical Chemistry Laboratory, for experiment number 2, which is the heat of formation from bomb calorimetry experiments. And in this case, we're going to be determining the heat of formation of naphthalene. And so we're going to do this by carrying out bomb calorimetry experiments, which allow us to determine the heat of combustion, which is the measured quantity, and then from that measured heat of combustion determine standard heat of formations for, in this case, naphthalene, which is what we'll do experimentally. And then we will compare that to other isomers, specifically another ringed isomer, azylene, which is a 7 and 5 membered ring and fused rings instead of 2 6-membered rings like naphthalene. But we won't compare that by measuring azylene directly in a bomb calorimetry because it's an expensive compound. What we're going to do is calculate, use chemistry, quantum mechanical calculations to calculate some thermochemistry parameters, in this case enthalpies, and we'll do it for naphthalene so we can compare it to what we get measured experimentally, and then we'll do it for one that we're not going to measure experimentally, which is azylene, and then be able to compare that isomer to naphthalene to see if it's more or less stable at room temperature. In other words, we'll be able to predict it from these thermochemistry calculations instead of doing the measurement ourselves. So I provide an introduction to calorimetry as a whole and specifically to bomb calorimetry, where we're going to use par oxygen bomb calorimeter, and I provide several operation guides, etc. to this. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail except to say the first week you're doing the experiments, and I provide quite a lot of information so you can do those experiments. You calibrate the calorimeter using benzoic acid, which has a very known heat of combustion, and from that you can calibrate your calorimeter and then run your naphthalene and any other unknown samples that you have through the bomb so that you can use that to determine the heat of combustion and then onto the heat of formation. Okay, and then the second week we're going to use at ASU we'll use Gauss view and Gaussian to calculate heat of combustions and therefore heat of formations for naphthalene and azylene, and we can do it also for benzoic acid if there's time as well, to make comparisons from what we calculate using thermochemistry ab initio quantum mechanical calculations to that what we measure directly in our experiment, and show that we can do it for things that we're not even going to measure directly like azylene. So that's what we'll spend the second week doing. And what I'll say is that by default you typically measure gas phase energies, and therefore gas phase energies or enthalpies and associated enthalpies. So we're going to calculate the gas phase energy for naphthalene, for oxygen, CO2, and water. And so this is what we will, in a sense, get from our ab initio calculations. What we want is the heat of combustion, which I write here. So to be able to do that, we need to know the heat of sublimation for naphthalene and the heat of vaporization of water, and those can be looked up. So you can look those up along with this, in a sense, from those numbers, be able to directly compare the experimental heat of combustion to what you're going to calculate here in the gas phase. Okay, so I provide that. I'm also going to follow this up with a screencast on doing some Gaussian and talk about these other calculation programs. And then in the third week, you're given a week for data analysis, and a lot of the time in data analysis is used to make sure you determine an accurate delta T. So when you do this combustion experiment, you have your power bomb sitting and you're measuring a temperature with a thermocouple, and then you ignite the system to start the combustion. You assume it goes to full combustion, and that raises the temperature within the power bomb, and it eventually steadies out. And so really what the trick is here is that usually this initial slope is not perfectly horizontal, neither is the final slope, and as you can see from some example data, it doesn't rise with a sudden delta t. So you have to be able to determine a delta t, but it's not very, you can't just take the final minus initial because there's not really an exact final temperature. It's constantly changing. And same with the initial temperature. So what do you use as the final and initial temperature? And I'll talk about that a little more in a second, except to say I provide an introduction to that here. I provide a couple additional papers on talking specifically about different methods to determine delta T, and the way we do it here is what I graphically show here, which is to fit a line here to indicate what the change in the initial temperature is, fit a line for here. So these are both equations for a line to get what the change in the final temperature is. And then we use the delta T where the area between these two under this curve and that curve are the same, and that is our TD. And then we take the delta T from this point on that line to this point on that line. And that gives one of the more unbiased, better methods for determining the delta T for this type of data. Okay, and so I provide that as well as some general thermodynamics for what you're considering when you're doing these reactions. So I provide that as well, and some of the general correction, PV term correction, so that you're not at specifically at 1 atmosphere of pressure. So how you make those corrections, since you were asked to calculate the standard state heat of formation. Okay, and so I talk about some of those general correction terms here and provide some examples, so as well as some references. I'll be back soon to give you some more about week 2 stuff, which is thermochemistry ab initio calculations, and week 3, which is some of the data analysis soon. So lastly, I just want to follow this up by quickly sketching what our initial problem is. So what you're measuring is you're measuring temperature as a function of time, and I'm going to exaggerate it. So what would be an ideal case is if you had, exactly horizontal, and then you combusted it and it raised and it was exactly horizontal here. Now it's easy to measure delta T because it's just that difference between the final temperature, which is the same everywhere, and the initial temperature, which is the same everywhere. So that's a very easy thing to do. But when you have not so ideal data, and see if I can actually change this color here, which is to say, for example, say your initial temperature is greatly changing, and then you combust it and it goes like that, and then it's still changing. Well, what is delta T? Where do you take it from? Do you take it from here and here? And so that in a sense is your delta T. Well, that doesn't seem very realistic. So one of the best methods at your disposal for doing this is to assume that there is some change in the final temperature, and you can usually fit that, and it's usually linear. And then same with the initial temperature, it's usually linear. So you have a line that describes the initial and a line that describes the final. Well, as you can tell, where you take delta T from at either this point or that point or somewhere along this curve, would change what that delta T value is. So where should you take it? Well, this is where it's changing temperature right here, right? So the best place to take it is kind of at that midpoint. And the way you can define that midpoint is where the area under this curve and the area under that curve is equal to each other. So you can move this midpoint around till they're equal to each other, and that's what I define as TD. So the change in temperature with time for the initial and final slope, and then you define TD where those two are equal to each other. So hopefully that helps give you a qualitative sense of what we're doing to help best determine what the delta T, or the change in temperature for these different combustions reactions, are for that. Again, I'll be back soon to further describe the quantum mechanical thermochemistry computational aspects of this lab as well.